strengths in messy juxtapositions, and praise for the compatibility between rigorous academic investigation and prayer, deep concern for the material stuff of the world and the justice of social organization, alongside commitments to transcendence of meaning and truth, where Catholic studies can hold together critical theories and boundless wonder. Today, I'm going to aim to locate that style as an interpretive matrix within which to make sense and perhaps a few inroads into the thought of two writers who are properly considered overwhelming, John Moriarty and Hans Urs von Balthasar. I'm going to argue that Moriarty and von Balthasar foreground the importance of reading texts according to interdisciplinary methods, perhaps even transdisciplinary methods, by writing with genre that defies categories made available to our disciplinary norms. Moriarty and von Balthasar certainly write in ways that include theology, philosophy, literature, religious studies, history, art, sociology, ecology, but they aren't just any one of those fields. Their approaches to meaning confounds attempts to make strict separations between spiritual and empirical ways of knowing. While I could spend the entirety of my 15 minutes just introducing the breadth and richness of their writing, I think it might be a little bit more fun for such a short paper to just give a brief sense as to why so many interpreters of Moriarty and von Balthasar describe these 20th century writers using similar words like dizzying, intimidating, impossible, erudite, genius, incomprehensible, inaccessible, and undisciplined. Von Balthasar was born to a patrician family in Lucerne, Switzerland in 1905. He earned a doctorate in Germanistic, the interdisciplinary study of German language and culture. And he spent a fascinating life as a sometimes Jesuit, but always Catholic priest. Though he never held a traditional academic post, he did work as a chaplain at the University of Basel. But what's most interesting, I think, about thinking about von Balthasar and the genre of, or style of Catholic studies is the way Joseph Ratzinger, later Pope Benedict XVI, talked about von Balthasar in his funeral eulogy. Ratzinger said, quote, "Henri de Lubac has called von Balthasar possibly the most cultured person of our time. Actually, the arc of his work spans from the predecessors of Socrates to Freud, Nietzsche, and Bertolt Brecht. It embraces the entire Western heritage of philosophy, literature, art, and theology," end quote. By the end of his life, von Balthasar had amassed a bibliography as an author of over 100 monographs, 110 translations, and 537 articles. And his work spanned original translations of early church fathers and contemporary Protestant and Catholic theologians, studies of poetry, literature, and music, as well as pastoral reflections and radio sermons on the saints, prayer, calendars, how to live with technology or within family life in the modern world. He founded a religious community and a publishing house from which he published most of his work, as well as the writings of the mystic he worked with, Adrian von Speyer. The most important intervention of von Balthasar's that many of us may have heard or may not have heard of before is a large trilogy on theological aesthetics, dramatics, and logic that's 15 volumes long and brings together this view of the entirety of European culture as a way of preparing it to be a theological resource for thinking about the triune God. I'm going to focus on the middle section of that triptych, the theodrama, as a genre today. But I wanted to give you some of that background, including the fact that von Balthasar was the inspiration for the Heavenly Bodies exhibit at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York in 2018, as a way to give a sense of how wide his interests were and how much he published. That background on von Balthasar could also apply to the Irish ecological mystic, John Moriarty. While he can't boast the same absurd literary productivity as Balthasar, reading Moriarty triggers a quite similar experience in intellectual vertigo. He was born in Morvain, Kerry in 1938, and he studied philosophy at University College Dublin. He went on to teach the history of European ideas at Leeds University, and then he spent 6 years in Canada as a lecturer. But at a certain point, he abandoned these academic posts to return to Ireland to live a simpler, more rural life on the West Coast. He worked as a gardener while publishing a series of books, most with Lilliput Press. and appearing on Irish radio and television. Before his death, much like von Balthasar, Moriarty planned what he called a monastic hedge school called Shlina Famine. The goal was to find a way to live in better solidarity with both spirituality and the earth. And throughout this time, he published a series of cross-cultural and interreligious rites of passage in his books, swirling storytelling that brought together Irish legend and Moriarty's original poetry into philosophical dialogue with Christian, Hindu, and indigenous spiritualities. Moriarty's books looks to the wisdom of myth as an antidote to the violence that humans do to the earth and one another. At various points, he calls his books movements or rituals or rites of passage or a pilgrim's progress or a Hazhonji song, all aspirations to prayer. For Moriarty, I'm just going to focus on his first 1994 major work titled Dreamtime. Now, what's going on in Dreamtimes and Theodramas? I want to suggest that these two ways of writing are performative insofar as they invite their reader to have an experience of something beyond what might be noticed in just discursive prose. Von Balthasar's Theodrama, like I said, brought together the history of European theater as a way to try to illuminate God's presence in history using theatrical ideas. Here, von Balthasar develops what he calls a theodramatic analogy for Christian theology, an extended study of themes in plays and performance that allows us to think about ideas like the world as a stage, or the roles we play in social interaction with one another, as tools to understand the way God acts in history. For von Balthasar, to interpret the triune God's self-revelation in the incarnate Christ requires theologians, Catholics, even skeptical philosophers, to refuse to think outside from a neutral or external standpoint. The idea of drama is such that if we walk into the theater, or if we were together, if we walked into a lecture hall to hear a paper, we'd be caught up within something. We can only interpret from within the story that we're living. Drama also points out that theology should not prompt a static sense of a boring God. For von Balthasar's salvation is a dramatic love story, one where God has truly taken the world stage in solidarity with humanity. That sense of being caught up in a story is also what animates the way Moriarty proceeds in his first book, Dreamtime. What he attempts here is what he calls a literary walkabout into the Irish Altagynga, and that word is the Australian Aboriginal term for the dreaming or dreamtime that's at the beginning of culture. As Moriarty writes, quote, "It is as necessary that we realize a past out of which to grow as it is to realize a present and future into which to grow," end quote. The way to heal the cultures of ecological havoc that perceive the world as a mere instrument for human productivity, Moriarty proposes that we return to something he calls cometage consciousness, a way of seeing and perceiving that unites people, animals, and Earth across the partitions of space, time, and perception. In writing Dreamtime, Moriarty proposes that we can tell our mythologies anew as a route to rediscover, in Pope Francis's term from Laudato Si, the Earth as a common home. Quote, "When eventually we arrive home, how astonished we will be to discover that we never left home," end quote. Now, there's not enough time to make all the sense of the surprising connections between an Irish ecological mystic and literary philosopher on the one hand, and this Swiss theologian and cardinal designate on the other. Von Balthasar was named to be a cardinal by Pope John Paul II, but died 2 days before receiving his red hat. But I do think that there are two ways in which these writers jump off the page as giving us a sense of what the genre of Catholic studies could be. Something sui generis that tries to see the Catholicity of the world expressed in the stories and cultures that we're drawn to, that give lives meaning. And one of the ways I think we can see this is by looking to the themes of music in their work, but also their interest in Christ's descent. One of the literary strategies in both Dreamtime and Theodrama regards the bringing together of various stories into convergence. and if you'll forgive me, my screen blanked for a second, is to bring these various strategies into convergence. One of the reasons that these two authors are so difficult to read is there's an entire library of insights that's working together with stories next to one another. Both Moriarty and von Balthasar make sense of this style by turning to music as a metaphor. They believe that, forgive me, I'm so sorry, reflection on the world must be from the world. Yet a partially mythology will imply a far less marvelous creation than the one in which humans live and move. And it's because it's in myths more than in houses that we are housed, according to Moriarty. It's in myths that our instinctive depths are housed. And if they aren't so housed, you can be sure that somewhere along the road we are walking, doesn't matter whether it is ascending or descending, somewhere myths are waiting to ambush us. These writers wield stories, like I said, in cascading reference with 4 or 5 or 6 different authors from the literary canon on each page, to try to discover something instinctive about how humans live in the world, where von Balthasar appeals to plays or psychodramas of a mystic's interior experience, Moriarty turns to Irish folklore and indigenous storytelling. As I foregrounded, these references to culture can be brought into productive tensions, juxtapositions, and interrelationships. What emerges are claims about what it means to be human, seen in the mirrors of stories worth embodying and worth living. It's because drama and folklore share ritual origins, and it should come as little surprise that both von Balthasar and Moriarty try to think God in the more modern world alongside ancient techniques that blend theatrical, religious, and civic performance. And that key theme of performance is why they both reach for music as an organizing principle. Von Balthasar and Moriarty develop genres of writing that permit the expression of an insight across a set of references, stories, and reflections, rather than through a set of arguments. In this way, image and symbol work alongside technical and metaphysical claims. Logic and aesthetics are co-equal partners. They express this idea by means of referring to music. Like the performance of these texts, musical ideas emerge over time and depend on the interplay of different voices and changing tones, pitches, instruments. Music not only expresses its own beauty, but evokes something beyond its boundaries. As Moriarty writes, quote, "It has been said that all art aspires to the condition of music. What I have written doesn't aspire to condition of art, but in its own proto-liturgical way, it does now and then aspire to the condition of prayer." Theodrama and Dreamtime, like Catholic studies scholarship, aims to open the fascinations of scholarly study to the possibility of a prayerful interpretation. How these musical images work for von Balthasar is the idea that there is a pluralism at work in the Christian imagination. In order to express truth, it has to be, in his words, symphonic. The idea can't be that simply the trumpets or the strings or the voices have the full sense of the richness of the world. It can only be understood as it emerges as a whole over the course of a symphony. I suggest, though, that this bringing together a symphonic or musical idea in their writing is also why Dreamtime and Theodrama are mythopoetic. And this is the point I want to end with. We tend to think of ideas, or at least von Balthasar and Moriarty would suggest as such, as a set of propositions or facts that we can acquire and then share. Their writing is so confounding because it tells stories that invite us to live into these ideas, to think about the journey as something undergone. That's why both writers, I think, turn to the mythopoetics of Christ's descent, something that they focus on by means of the story of Jesus's descent on Holy Saturday. Is there a beeping in the background? I'm not sure if there's a timer going off somewhere. Of course, it was me. The mythopoetics of Christ's descent, and I'll end here. Both Moriarty and von Balthasar find a key point in the idea of God's solidarity with suffering creation all the way to the point of death on the cross and beyond to a descent into hell. For Moriarty, he sees this as Christ's descent knee-deep into the world's karma, an idea that our distinction from the created world, from nature, from our ecological existence, is brought to God's attention by means of Jesus's willingness to be in history with us. For von Balthasar, a sense of all of salvation history concretized in the experience of the Christ who is in solidarity with death to the point of God-forsakenness by the Father. Both of these senses are not technically theological ideas in the sense that they emerge from something the church has taught and now they're expounded. They're mythic speculations on what might be the case for something that happened after Jesus's death. But it gives us a sense of what it means to live in the catastrophe of the world after the 20th century. And that's why I think Catholic studies can look to these writings, not as explicit theology, but as a way of opening up the world for new wonder. Thanks so much for being with me this morning and for your patience with all my technical issues. Thank you.